So over the last few years, I've worked much more with artists and designers to think about the future of humanity and how it might be changed, or how indeed it is changing as a result of new technologies. One very simple example was a couple of designers at the Royal College of Art, James and Jimmy, who were developing a telephone tooth implant, which is as it sounds. You know, you've got a cavity, you go to your dentist, you can have the silver, platinum, gold, or the telephone, which, you know, sounds like a peculiar thing, but there was a kind of critique on the miniaturization of mobile technology, which of course is a narrative that we still see within technology today. Everything's getting smaller, but is it? Their proposition that we could have this telephone that was implanted in our tooth engaged people morally about the questions, the limits of technology, how far we're prepared to go in using it within our person. And again, as an aside, they decided that they would showcase this at a technology fair, and when they were asked by the journalists, when is this going to come out onto the market, they said, "Oh, we're just artists. This isn't coming out at all. You know, we're just thinking about the ideas." Nobody covered it. Nobody covered it at all. 6 months later, they decided to do the same thing again, go to a technology fair with the tooth implant. When they were asked the same question again, they said, "It'll be out in 6 months." And they made the cover of Time magazine with that particular design. So what interests me about their work, the work of artists and designers, is that interface between the fact and the fiction, the possibility to create engagement around narratives about the future, which I think are crucial to our engagement with it. You know, I'm a firm believer that in fact fiction gets us further than fact. Oh, by the way, as you can kind of tell, I'm speaking in sentences composed of 140 characters, just to help those people that are tweeting along the way. So there's nothing virtual about the future. This seemed like, this is one of those titles, and those who have done this kind of work for a while will know, you know, you sometimes think very carefully about what sort of title you want to put together and then speak to it. This is one of those titles where I thought, that sounds good, I'll do that. And then left with the burden of trying to do it. But it seemed to me that the idea of there being nothing virtual about the future appealed to the concept of trying to relate the analog to the biodigital. It seems to me these things are concurrent. We are both analog beings and biodigital beings. These are not mutually exclusive. We live quite comfortably in synthesis between those two ideas. But of course, even the concept of we is problematic here. And one of the things we've learned over this last 15 years, which I think is defined by the rise of digital cultural studies, the maturation of that body of literature, whereby methodologies have become more sophisticated, understandings much more complex, and we get the fact that we can't talk generically about any of this stuff, that in fact it's always geographically located and culturally located. So the idea of there being a digital creative class out there, I think is a myth, and the rhetorics that surround it about whether we're too digital or too little, I think are really open to question. But when thinking about the future, I think we're also misled somehow in ways that can be positive. As I said earlier, I'm a believer in the value of fictions to lead us down a path that may have nothing to do with what the future actually turns out to be, but nevertheless engages us in quite interesting ways. So I was at the Cheltenham Science Festival a couple of weeks ago, and Vivienne Parry, who was a former presenter of Tomorrow's World, and for those of you that aren't British or have been in Britain for a while, Tomorrow's World is a BBC flagship science program that's been around for a few decades now. And it was always the kind of program, early evening program, that would talk about what's coming up in the future and what we ought to be concerned about. And Vivienne said that one of the things that the program would do is always, you can imagine every spot that they have, at the end of it, they would finish by saying, and it will be available within 5 years. And that would be how the future was articulated. There was a bracket around which people had to be engaged by. If you said it would be here in 20 years, who cares about that? If it's here within 5 years, then you really engage people quite important ways. So she said that irrespective of what we were talking about, what they were talking about, these technologies were likely to be here very, very soon. But her point was, and in fact the subject of the talk was, tomorrow's world never comes. That in fact the way in which they imagined that future, the way in which they reported the technologies, had a very limited relationship to how they actually came into being. She went a bit further in saying that none of the things that they actually talked about came into being in the way that they articulated them, but I think that was probably unfair. It seems to me that many of them have, and here's a few of them. Cryonics, food pills, space tourism, electric cars. Now, we could talk about each of those as either being here or not. Cryonics, you can do it today. You can sign up for cryonic suspension, which is what some people wish to do in order to have the possibility of coming back to life after they've died. And if you're interested, you can have the head-only or full-body suspension, depending on your budget. It's about $20,000 for the head-only, about $150 for the full body. So depending on what you want to do, you can suspend the whole lot. I mean, clearly Kevin would only suspend the head, but many people here, I think, would like to keep their bodies too. So this is a possibility. In fact, I know people that have signed up to this. They walk around with a necklace that has a little medallion at the end and says, if I die, this is what needs to happen, because what needs to happen very quickly. You have to get the body to the place where it needs to be preserved, and if you don't do that quickly, you can't really do very much. Any significant amount of time, the brain turns to jelly, and you can't really expect to bring much back if reanimation becomes a possibility. So yes, reanimation doesn't happen today, but this was a technology that exists, and there are cultures of people that are doing this. Food pills, well, we don't have those, and the sort of standard remark is, of course we don't have those. We like to eat. We like the taste of food. We like the culture of food. It's something that we enjoy, and so why would we want food pills? We were wrong about that, or food sprays, or whatever it might be. We also have McDonald's, we have Burger Kings, we have all kinds of foods that perhaps don't celebrate those values of culinary culture that we appeal to when saying that food pills are a ridiculous idea. And so maybe we're not quite at the food pill stage, but arguably eating has become devalued in certain parts of our lives. Space tourism, most of you haven't been up to space recently or if at all. You can do zero gravity flights now, so if you have a spare $2,000, you can do this in the US, in Russia, not here in the UK yet, but Virgin Galactic has already set up its base within Scotland, so who knows, quite soon there might be that opportunity. Stephen Hawking's done it, so anyone who has that cash can get close to space, and some would argue it's around the corner. Electric cars, of course, we know they're around. They're not necessarily, I don't have a car. Said to people there's a pressure to have cars. I don't have a car, but of course the idea of electric cars is something that seems plausible at this stage. And so the idea that the future is still not likely to happen in the way that they articulated it back then is unclear. But what's crucial is that how we describe the future governs our orientation towards it. So we might describe it in any number of ways, as indeed many of the speakers have over this last day and a half. So we might think about our future as being imminent, something that we need to consider immediately. We might think of it as remote, as plausible, as unlikely, imaginary. These are all words that describe and I think define the way in which we respond to the future as something of either significant concern or something that we don't need to worry too much about. It seemed to me that the concept of virtuality within a lot of the literature, the early literature on digital culture, mistakenly located cyberspace outside of some other space, which was often mistakenly referred to as the real versus the virtual. I think most people here would argue that, in fact, those two concepts we should just throw out. The idea that they're separate places, metaphysically, I think, is problematic. And what I want to suggest is that something that I think many of you would take for granted, that there is consequentiality to life online, life in cyberspace, that we have become able to realize through the contributions of social scientists who have made evident what's actually taking place. But I think one of the consequences of this, one of the consequences of locating virtual space outside of physical space, is that it led to its being fetishized. It was something that actually made it exciting, that there was this other world that we could be part of now, that had different values, different communities, different ways of relating to each other. The body wasn't there. You remember this stuff. It gave it an appeal that I think allowed people to become excited about it. And I think that's a good thing on the one hand, but it neglected the fact that there is consequentiality to what takes place. So I think rather than the idea of it being a form of escapism, to be online, to be outside of this other world, I think that the fantasy of digital spaces gave the real world greater consequentiality. And in one of the conversations yesterday, it came up that, of course, literature, theatre are all mechanisms through which both escapism but also the interaction between fantasy and reality are played out. And the way in which those texts affect our sense of the world has been apparent for years. So the digital experiences are not necessarily a change in kind, they may be just a change in degree. But I still want to argue that, in fact, the consensual, for want of a better word, hallucination of these experiences did give it a tangible reality that was distinct, that in fact the fantasy became a common part of our real worlds in a very powerful way. And we might argue in response to that in fact these were hyper-real experiences. They were defined by that fusion between what happened in these online worlds, these digital spaces, and what took place outside of it. So that's the first part. But I still think we may argue that the future is perpetually outside of our reach. And I think that the idea, therefore, that the virtual is an appropriate term to describe these worlds is based on that idea. So the future is something that never exists in the present. We are always oriented towards the future, whether it's an hour from now, a year from now, or 100 years from now. The future is persistently creeping up on us, if you like. And so we are resigned to the fact that we are only ever almost there. And I think the consequence of this is an explanation for why virtuality was such an appealing concept, that it created an unreal status to these places, which explained them. It was unreal. It was not quite here yet, and possibly something that we had to realize. And that's a very kind of hopeful rhetoric, I think, to instill around this technology. So the unrealness of virtual futures was, I think, a central part of its currency.